Is it not true that in many human journeys to the interior that we begin with a question? So we'll begin with a question this afternoon, but we'll need a little bit of foundation for that question. So let's start this. Let's go back into our early 20s when we were thinking about our lives and we were thinking about happiness. We thought about our work, what we would do. We thought about where we would live, perhaps. We would thought about maybe what adventures, would we want to ride across Mongolia on a motorcycle? Would we want to create a great lasagna? And then we thought, yeah, if I do those things, happiness flows from them. Okay. So the question that we'll start with then is, when you remember back then, are you as happy as you predicated you would be today? And I have to suggest that perhaps many of you are, but our culture does not think that that's very real. In 2011, here in America, remember there's only about 312 million people in America. In 2011, there were 243,000 prescriptions for antidepressants written. That same year, there were 147 million prescriptions for anti-anxiety agents. Something amiss about that, isn't it? Happiness seems to be escaping some of us. But it isn't just here in America. And in many ways, this is quite disturbing. In 2009, in the world, more people committed suicide than died in every war and in every homicide in the world combined. 250,000 people died in wars that year. 500,000 people died in homicides. 750,000 people. 1 million people committed suicide in the world. And the clinicians in our audience will tell us, well, Rick, if that's true, that means 15 or 20 million tried. So something is missing in our lives when it comes to happiness. I wonder why it is that when we were in our 20s, we thought it would flow from that. And here we are looking at these sort of numbers. Well, maybe it's the kind of things we pick when we're in our 20s. What do we think about? We think, it'll be my job. Earlier today, I was standing around and people were introducing themselves. And I didn't hear anybody introduce themselves other than their name, of course, but what they did. I wondered, jeepers, if I told somebody what I did, what would really they know about me? There'd be a giant gap between what I do and who I am. But when we're young, we think, yeah, that's it. It'll be my job. That'll define who I am. That seems not to work very well. How about the other one when we're young, too? Money, right? We think, oh, yes, I'll be financially successful, and that'll be great. I have a Toyota Corolla now. And when we're 20, we really don't think like dramatic things. We don't want a Lamborghini. We think, yeah, a new Toyota Corolla would be really great. But then as soon as it happens, and we can make the money for the new Toyota Corolla, we want an Audi A8L. Just sort of bumps up all the time. But doesn't work either. About 4 years ago, they did a study in America. Of course, by the way, when I tell you this study, you'll know it's the only place in the world you could do it. Not doing this one in Somalia. And that is lottery winners who won over $100 million. And here's what they found out. That 50% wished they would not have won. And 25% more wished they would not have won as much. Yeah, money doesn't cut it, you know. And then the last, I suppose, when we're young, perhaps it's a bit crass, but we think power would be nice. The ability to get what I want would be really a great thing. That'll make me happy. Really? You guys ever watch The Sopranos? Tony apparently always gets what he wants. Does he ever seem happy? Nero became emperor at 18, and by the way, everyone loved him. Nero, yeah, everybody loved him. He was building orphanages and taking care. And he got his way every day about everything because he was the emperor. About 8 years later, he's lighting dinner parties by burning humans alive. And of course, he kills his mother. Matricide. It seems that perhaps power really does corrupt a bit. This is what we get confused about when we're young. We think that happiness equals externals in life, something outside of ourselves, and that happiness will flow from the externals that we achieve. Probably not so much. Happiness does not equal externals in life. So then, what might it be? Well, in order to do that, I don't think it's such a bad thing. Let's go back, like really far back. How about mid-300 BC, about a month and a half before I was born? Aristotle writes the Nicomachean Ethics, and he says that happiness equaled virtue plus the externals. Now, he doesn't say that externals aren't important for some things, but you know it's a very small e. And actually, we'd be somewhat appalled if we knew what they were. You had to have some kind of shelter. You couldn't be living outdoors. And you couldn't be starving. But the key for Aristotle is virtue. So what's a good definition? Well, we're going to stay away from the philosophy definitions. How about a great common parlance definition? And that is that virtue is doing the right thing at the right time and for the right reason. You know what's really fascinating? We've heard about 15 or 14 talks today, and in 7 of them, people said, do the right thing. Well, actually, that's part of the basis of virtue, that we do the right thing. Now, if that's true, we should be able to see it, that virtue, doing a virtuous thing, should make people happier. So I'm going to tell you a story. We all know what compassion is, an understanding, a willingness to put ourselves out to others. So I'm going to tell you that there was a fellow who taught for about, an academic, taught for about 6 years at Yale, very successful there, came to Cambridge, taught at Harvard for about another 5 or 6 years. Towards the end of that, I'd given him a call. We were having kind of a dinner party, and I asked him if he had interest to come and join us and chat about something that perhaps he had interest in. And he said, oh, Rick, you know, I'd like to do that, but you know, my life's changing a bit. I'm not sure if I'm going to be around. I'll give you a call in a few weeks. Calls me in 4 weeks and says, Rick, I can't come. My life's changing. I mentioned those things I could do. And I lost him. I don't know where he went. About a year and a half later, I discovered that he had left Cambridge. He had gone to Quebec. He had bought a home and just began taking in indigent people who were physically and emotionally handicapped and caring for them himself completely. The book came out about maybe 2 years later, in which he said that he had never been happier in his life. Never. But you don't have to be a fancy academic for that. Back in 2000, a young woman from Australia went to holiday in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city of Mongolia. And she was appalled by all the children living on the street. Part of the terror of that is that the average temperature in Mongolia is 22 degrees Fahrenheit. And these kids are living in tunnels underneath the city to try to stay warm. She went back to Australia. She sold her house. She got a long-term visa. Went back to Mongolia, rented a small piece of property, bought a group of gears, you know, the round felt tents, and started taking kids in. My colleagues went to visit to bring some medical supplies in 2007, and they said she had 198 kids then, and she had to work to feed them all. And they said they'd never seen such a happy woman, ever. So then, if we think about it, it is possible that virtue could lead to happiness. But another way to think about it is, let's think the opposite. If you don't do virtuous things, then you should be unhappy. Let's see if that works. There was a young man, he was about 17 years old. He took a summer course at Georgetown. He had gone out to the movies one evening, and on the walk home, in a beautiful, heavy-treed area of Georgetown, he was approaching an intersection. And across the intersection was a police officer who had a suspect with one cuff on, and the policeman was trying to manage the call box. And he called out to the person and said, "Hey, kid, come here, give me a hand." And I put my head down, and I pretended I didn't hear him, and walked back to the dormitories. And I got up the next morning to shave, and I couldn't look at myself. I hated myself. And it didn't stop. All summer long. I come back. I'm dating a very wonderful woman at that time. I don't call her because I'm not worthy to have such a great person in my life. Want a little aside about that? How about 7 years later, I marry her? And 44 years later, I actually a lot of times still think I'm not worthy to have her in my life. So sometime in September of that, I decided this had to end. I was talking to somebody, and he was helping me, and this had to end. So I had to forgive myself. I had to let that go and promise myself it'd never happen again. I was in the military for 7 years. I've traveled a lot of weird places. It's never happened again, because I never want to look at myself like that again. So perhaps it is true that if we do not do virtuous things, we will be unhappy. So how can we attain virtue? The first thing we have to do is we have to think virtuous thoughts. The positive psychologists over at Harvard are right. It's about your thoughts. Of course, they're a little late, because in the early 3rd century BC, Plato said exactly the same thing in the Republic. First attempt to see human beings in a kind of scientific way. He said, we see behavior, the antecedent of behavior are our passions, our emotions, but the antecedent of that is our thoughts. If you don't think virtuous thoughts, try to read virtuous books, watch virtuous movies, very hard to be virtuous, very difficult. Your thoughts have to be founded and grounded in that. The next thing, habits. You try to develop habits of virtue. Ted Williams had hit a home run in a particularly important game, and it was at the bottom of the 9th, and it was bases loaded, and they won by 1 run. So the journalists are all over. "Oh, Ted, you're so lucky, you're so lucky, I can't believe how lucky you are." So, you know, Williams had no real management with the press at all. And he simply said, "Yeah, guys, it's absolutely incredible. The more I practice, the luckier I get." Yes, the more you practice virtue, the more it becomes part of ourselves. It flows from us. And lastly, and perhaps the most important thing of all, is that you have to cultivate virtuous friends. Out of all of these things, Aristotle says that there is only one that is crucial, and that is virtuous friends. These people will inspire you and support you. Why? Because it's difficult. Happiness is difficult. It doesn't flow from anything, pretty much, except hard work. And our friends will help us through that. So, when you leave here today, and you're thinking about all the things that happened, and maybe you might be nice enough to think a little bit about this talk. And if you do, what you should think about is that, gee, am I really as happy as I want it to be? And if the answer is no, you're going to try something called Pascal's wager. Pascal, 17th century Enlightenment thinker. And here's the wager. So you say, well, I'm not quite as happy. Well, that's good. Maybe that's true. And then the next thing you say is, yeah, you know that stuff Varieur said? I don't believe it. I don't believe any of it. But I don't have another plan right now. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try being virtuous. I'm going to try these things for 6 months. And if they don't work, I'll say, see, I knew Varieur was wrong. But if they start to work, continue that. I can suggest it's probably really worth it. Those dreams you had when you were in your early 20s, they're still available to you. But it's about virtue, and it's very difficult. Thank you.